good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to another Parliamentary and Scientific Committee discussion webinar. For those of you who are regular attendees, you will know that we've had a theme over the last few meetings of looking at the impact of climate change and how we decarbonise various parts of our activity. And this evening is another step in that direction, which is entitled The Move to Sustainable Non-Fossil Carbon Feedstocks. And I'm delighted to say that this has been organised in conjunction with the Society of Chemical Industries. And so I am very grateful to them for their support in helping us to facilitate this meeting. And to help us discuss this important topic, we have four excellent panelists, each of whom is going to speak to us for approximately 10 minutes. The format will be the same as usual, which is that I will introduce our speaker and give you an idea of who they are, but I will leave it to them if they feel they want to elaborate on any specific experience or role that they have, and then they will have up to 10 minutes to make a presentation. I'm going to try and keep it all quite tight to time because that will leave plenty of opportunity for questions and answers at the end. But that said, I am not an ogre in these cases. If I can ask you to try and keep to 10 minutes, but I will let you have a little bit of leeway because it's your views that we're very keen to hear. But I will interrupt and say, you know, could you start to wrap up if I think it's getting completely out of hand. So after the presentations, we will then, as I said, move to our question and answer session. And as usual, can I please ask everyone to use the Q&A function, not the chat, not the hands up. Please use the Q&A function. The reason for that is it allows the PNSC team to see who's asking your questions, and then they will marshal them into the right order for me, and then I will be able to call you. And when I call you, you will be invited in as a panelist, and you'll be able to ask your question in person. Usual rules of Zoom, which I'm sure we're all familiar with now. If you're not speaking, please do keep your microphone on mute. I think that's probably all I need to say at this point, other than I'm looking forward to yet another very interesting meeting. And to kick us off with that, our first speaker is Andrea Sapanaru, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, who is Clean Future Marketing Director, Fabric Cleaning at Unilever. And Andrea, you're going to talk to us about the drive for moving from fossil feedstocks. Over to you, ready? 10 minutes, please.
Okay, there we go. The unmuting part is the hardest one. Firstly, can you guys hear me? Can you guys see my screen? Right, thank you so much. Thank you for the intro. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. As Steven said, I'm the Global Marketing Director for Fabric Cleaning at Unilever, and the key word here is marketing. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an environmental impact specialist. I'm here to share the perspective of the everyday consumers. Firstly, why does Unilever care about moving away from fossil feedstocks? This is an example from our laundry products. And as you can see, most ingredients are based on fossil fuels. And this is the same across all consumer goods companies. Excluding the consumer use phase, our ingredients contribute 3/4 of our GHG footprint. And moving to a renewable carbon is a crucial lever for us to reduce our emissions. The climate emergency is sinking in for all citizens globally. All of us acknowledge the environmental breakdown it entails and are demanding change fast. And COVID-19, if anything, acted as an accelerator of a trend that was in the making and was experienced by a lot as a glimpse of what is to come if we do not act now. Our products at Unilever Home Care touch the lives of 1 billion people every day. And the conversation we have with our consumers is like no other, because our products are part of their world every day. And they tell it as bluntly as it is. Climate change is the largest concern of all, and we as a society need to tackle it head on. 71% agreed that the climate crisis is as serious and critical to tackle as COVID-19. And that was even at the height of the pandemic. There's a growing number of consumers that are making their decisions based on sustainability criteria. For instance, over half of shoppers have already stopped buying a product or service because of its negative impact on the environment, or have switched their product to one that's making a positive impact. Ecoactives are shoppers who are both highly concerned about the environment, and they're also taking actions to reduce their waste, like avoiding buying products that contain plastic or using refillable water bottles. In contrast, eco-dismissers have limited interest in the environment, and they do not think that they can make a difference. The only action that dismissers are likely to take to reduce waste is using their own bag for purchase. And what you can see here is that the growth of ecoactives is accelerating and forecasted to exceed 50% by 2027. This is great news for us. However, there's still a big intention-action gap. This chart is showing you the difference between when we ask people whether they want to purchase sustainably versus how often they actually do. This gap is 34% across all shopper segments. And it is lower for the ecoactives that I just talked about earlier, but even for them, it still exists at 22%. So, what makes up this intention-action gap, and how do we close it? 2 in 3 shoppers say that a barrier to being sustainable is that sustainable products are harder to find or more expensive. And the reality is that whilst there is a desire from consumers, they're not yet enabled to consume and live sustainably, neither by Unilever nor by any of its competitors. The sustainable choice is coming as a trade-off on performance and is unaffordable to many. If you were to think about it, I'm sure that you could place examples of brands that you've seen on the shelves on this 4-quarter matrix. From my experience, only about 10% of consumers are willing to compromise on performance for sustainability. This need to compromise, this friction, is common to almost all sectors, and it needs to change. And reducing this friction is our responsibility and our opportunity. This is why it is at the very core of our Unilever home care strategy, delivering performant products and services sustainably without excluding the majority of consumers from this equation. In other words, affordable. We call this the Clean Future Triangle. And here are 2 examples of how we are closing the gap. The first one is it's an example from our dishwashing liquids. Here we introduced a completely new ingredient that is cleaning the dishes, made not from fossil fuels and not from the problematic palm oil that most clean carbon alternatives are based on, but by fermenting sugar. And what's so special about this new cleaning ingredient? On top of giving us a great dish cleaning performance, it is also milder on hands. And thus, it's offering a superior benefit for our consumers. Okay, so we don't have sunlight in the UK, but the second example is on a brand that you should all be familiar with. On our Persil laundry detergent, we switched to plant-based stain removers without compromise on cost or performance. This is very important because not only did we do it in the UK, we did it across our entire portfolio around the world. This isn't a limited edition or a single variant. It is the core of our business. And we're talking about a brand that's among the top 6 highest penetration ones in the world, alongside Coca-Cola and Facebook. We know that if we want to drive real impact with our Clean Future strategy, we must go big. Consumers say that it's government and manufacturers' joint responsibility to drive change when it comes to the environmental damage. And I've shown you a few examples of what we at Unilever are doing to move away from chemicals made from fossil fuels. But Unilever is a very small part of the chemical industry. We're a downstream user of the chemicals. And without the chemicals value chain adapting to provide us with renewable and recycled carbon and chemicals, we won't be able to remove fossil fuels from our products. And we need not only the pioneering startups and the mid-sized enterprises, but also the big chemical players to invest in this renewable chemistry. And to give you a sense of the challenge, let me give you an example. We've partnered with a startup to develop and commercialize a new renewable surfactant. They recently deployed a big investment to double the scale of their production. This got them to a capacity of 50,000 tons. That's great. But for our main surfactant, we need 1 million tons every year. So we need the big chemical companies to invest because they're the ones who can supply us at this type of scale. Unilever makes consumer products. We don't make chemicals. For our products to change, chemicals need to change. And for chemicals to change, the ecosystem needs to change. And the key enabler in this ecosystem change is a supporting policy environment to renewable carbon. Indeed, we cannot achieve this agenda with only the industry push. We need the support of policymakers to bolster supply of new technologies of renewable carbon, but also to enable these technologies to compete on an even playing field with black carbon. First, on the supply side, we need policies that support the research on technologies that enable carbon circulation, such as industrial biotech, carbon capture and utilization, chemical recycling, to make these technologies more efficient and therefore more cost-effective. We don't want and we cannot afford to sell products that are more premium. We cannot charge for sustainability. You've seen that only a minority of consumers will pay for that. Now, once these technologies being researched are ready for scale up, we need policies that de-risk the investment that's being made to move from pilot to industrial production. On the demand side, it's important that we get a clear policy signal in the UK that the transition to non-fossil carbon chemicals is the way to go. Lots of companies are waiting for this policy signal to make the required investments. I'll finish and use my last few seconds to give a nutshell summary. One, consumers want more sustainable options, but only a small minority are willing to compromise. When it comes to renewable carbon ingredients, the current alternatives cost as much as 50% more. And what's more, most aren't even available at scale. We need to make the sustainable choice frictionless for all consumers by removing the need to compromise on performance or affordability. And to achieve this, we need the full ecosystem to change. And policy is a key enabler to create new technologies, deliver at scale, and level the playing field versus black carbon. And with that, I pass it back to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you very much indeed, and perfect timing. So thank you for that. A lot of very interesting figures and information in there. I mean, this is the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee, so your consumers are our voters. And so there is always this sort of relationship that has to be pursued, and that we have to take voters, citizens, consumers along with us. You talked about, particularly in your last sentence, about using sustainable products costing at the moment around 50% more. Is that correct? Did I hear that correct?
I was referring to the on cost of the formulation if you wanted to switch to ingredients that are made from renewable carbon. So it's not necessarily that the end product will cost 50% more. But
the feedstocks would potentially, and that is because of the scale. So if you were to scale up and find some, or the sector were to scale up, that cost would presumably reduce in line with.
That's what we would expect. Yes.
Yes. So it doesn't have to be we will have to pay more to be sustainable. It can be achieved. It's just finding the right roadmap. The other point I wanted to make was you showed us some very interesting figures about public attitudes towards wanting to do the right thing, and then the gap between action and aspiration. Do you see the trend towards action and aspiration closing? Are people willing to do more? Is it, it may be difficult to start with, but as products become more available, et cetera, et cetera. So presumably you will continue to track these figures.
Yes, and actually we've seen quite an improvement in the UK in the last year, presumably once people have stopped worrying about whether they can find the toilet paper in the supermarkets, they went back to and actually accelerated the trends that we had seen prior to COVID of acting more sustainably.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure there will be some questions for you later. But Andrea, thank you very much. Right, we will now move on to our next speaker, which is Thomas Burke. Thomas, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thomas is Managing Director for BASF UK and Ireland. And Thomas will speak on the challenge of reconfiguring a whole supply chain, which obviously follows on beautifully from what Andrea was saying. So Thomas, over to you, 10 minutes, please.
Yes, thanks so much, Stephen and Andrea. Andrea, especially thank you for the challenge, because the challenge is about this wheel here, because what Andrea was talking about, what the consumers are demanding these days is more or less requesting that we need to reinvent the wheel about how we are making chemicals. And this is what I want to talk to you today a little bit. And I take the example that Andrea has given. So when we're talking about surfactants, cleaning, so it's an everyday problem, right? From a chemicals perspective, what this means is you need a hydrophobic tail and a hydrophilic head group. Why is that? Because one piece will attach to the dirt and the other piece will attach to the water, and thereby it washes out the whole dirt that you are having in your clothes. So sounds pretty simple. Now let's think about what we have done over the last couple of decades in order to solve this easy problem. And I don't want you to read all of this. I just wanted to give you a little bit of perspective how the chemical industry works. What you see here is what we call value chains. So we start at the very bottom with crude oil and natural gas. And then we are splitting those carbon chains in such pieces that we can rebuild them in order to get to certain chemicals that we otherwise need. And I've just taken roughly here with the red arrow the path that is needed in order to get to current used surfactants, right? It will go up the ethylene value chain. So we can make a test now who knows exactly how these chains work. It's fairly complex, they are highly integrated, and they are efficient. And in order to do something like that, what you need is very efficient production processes and also very efficient ways of producing this on a big scale. We were already talking about scale up. So to give you a little bit of flavor what this means, what you see here is BASF's headquarters in Ludwigshafen. It's the biggest chemical plant in the world, fully integrated. You see the River Rhine here on the bottom, and everything above the river and also on below the river, that is our chemical plant. Now, obviously, this doesn't tell you too much probably. So we've put it on top of the city of London, right? So you see Hyde Park on the left-hand side, the British Museum on the upper right side. This is just one example of such an integrated chemical plant. Yes, it's the biggest, but when we are talking about these integrated plants, BASF alone has currently 6 of them, and we are building more of them. So we are talking here about very efficient production processes where all value streams are used. We are talking here about sustainability because the technologies are working hand in hand to ensuring that all side streams are used, energies are used in a perfect way, and so on and so forth. Now, you can imagine if we are getting the challenges that we need to change this, what we need to change are those value streams, right? Which is fine. What comes out of these highly efficient value streams is literally everything that you see around yourself. So our tangible world is based on these petrochemical products. And this goes from the stuff where you would probably have a pretty good feeling that, yes, this must be chemicals, all the way to things that you have never thought about, most likely. For example, your vitamin pills, right? Or also the paints that you're using, everything, nearly the whole world that we are seeing at the moment was originally built on petrochemical value streams. And this is what we now need to change. To give you a little bit of a flavor of how big that problem is, This is the total share of petrochemicals on the total oil and gas consumption that we are seeing every year. And I want to remember you one single number. Say 10% of all the oil and gas that is out there is at the moment used in order to create the material world around us, give or take. It's oil and it's gas. For us as a chemical industry, not super important whether it's one or the other. We can use both. But nevertheless, say 10% of all the oil and gas that is out there is constituting this world here around us. That means if the consumers now want to move away from that, we need to somehow find carbon sources of the same scale, because we need those molecules. We are thinking in molecules here, right? So that is what we need to make sure. And then we need to make sure that we somehow smartly integrate those molecules in such a way that these new production processes are as efficient as the one that we are having at the moment. And this is where Andrea is then talking about the cost and the efficiencies that we need in order to bring the costs down, the scale up, and so on and so forth. So you see now where the challenge is when it comes to changing those value streams. However, is that possible? It's absolutely possible, and we have already done it, actually. To give you an example, we stick again with the surfactant world, right? Not all surfactants today are still made out of fossils, right? And there are also renewable options. Some of those renewable options have developed again over decades, and they are also very efficient, high productivity, low cost. However, they are made out of the most efficient fatty acid source that you are finding on the planet, which is palm. Palm oil is a very good natural plant in order to get the fatty acids that we need in order to produce these products. And like Andrea already pointed out, palm doesn't have a very good reputation, and thereby we are trying to find alternative sources. Because otherwise, so I give you an example here, BASF is also a big user, obviously, of palm oil, and we are really looking very deeply into a lot of consequential problems that we are getting when we are trying to substitute the petrochemicals with a renewable value stream like the one that we have around palm, right? We need to think about what can we do in order to protect the forest? What can we do in order to make sure that the farmers are really participating, and so on and so forth. So a whole lot of other problems that you're creating by moving away from the petrochemical into a renewable. Why is that? Again, remember the 10% that we were talking about on the oil and gas share, 10%, this is what needs to be substituted. Those are huge volumes. Or we need to fundamentally change the way how we are consuming and the way how our material world looks like. BASF has given itself a very clear strategy. One of our 6 pillars, strategic pillars, is sustainability. We are working on this topic now for more than a decade very intensely, and we have even included it in our vision statement and mission statement and the vision how we want to do that. We want to create chemistry for a sustainable future. However, what we definitely have to do when we are looking into how we are doing that is we need to make sure that whatever solution we are coming up with is able to yield roughly the same kind of productivity that we are seeing from those value chains that I was talking about, and that we are ensuring that thereby the efficiencies are there to allow that these products are bought not only from people that have sufficient money, but that can be bought also by the next 3 billion of people that are soon to live on this planet on top of the 7 that we already have. And that is the challenge, and it's a challenge that BASF is more than happy to take. So we are fully committed to this. We have heavily invested, for example, into wind parks in order to get away from the energy consumption that we are having at the moment, which is based primarily on natural gas and on oil. So this is what we are trying to do, and we are working very closely together along the value chain with companies like Unilever, but also with our upstream suppliers in order to make sure that we are able to move away from these petrochemical processes. And that's it. in short, Stephen, I hope I'm still in time and there's some time for questions.
Perfect. Thomas, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. The scale of the challenge that you face can't possibly be underestimated, but it's very warming to hear of the efforts you're putting in. 2 points that struck me is obviously you're breaking things down into molecules, and it's the molecules that you need that you gain from petrochemicals. Are there any molecules that are impossible to replicate without using petrochemicals?
Yes, of course there are. We can't do everything. At the end, nature is more or less putting an upper barrier to it. However, a lot can be done. It's not so much what can be done. It's the question, and I think we're going to hear about that in a second from one of the other speakers. It's the question whether it can be done in an efficient way, right? Because you can do a lot from a chemical standpoint, everything that is possible from a nature standpoint, but it will only work if you're really able to scale it up.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And my other question really was around the reputation of palm oil, because it has got a terrible reputation. But it's not the palm oil itself, it's the way it's being that developing countries have rushed towards stripping out ancient forests to plant palm oil. Is there any issue with palm oil in and of itself, or is it just the way it's being planted and used? So if we could find a more sustainable source of it, it would be a great substitute. Is that right?
Yes. So we have, for example, heavily invested in trying to make those supply chains more sustainable. RSPO is here obviously the key word, making sure that the challenges that we are seeing around these value chains are resolved. The point is, as I said, from a nature standpoint, if you just have a look at the plant, the palm tree is producing in a very, very efficient way. Nature is producing in a very, very efficient way, fatty acids here. And that means whenever you're moving away from palm, you will be moving to another plant that probably isn't as efficient in producing those fatty acids. Or you come up with completely different technologies. And I think Nick is going to talk about a couple of those technologies in a second, whereby you are creating then molecules that are produced in a completely different way.
Brilliant, Thomas, thank you very much. And you've teed Nick up perfectly for that. So we will move on to our next speaker, which is Nick Chandler. Chandler, I hope that's right. Who is Group Chief Science Officer at Kroder. And I think, Nick, you're going to talk to us about some of those issues and the technology required to make those or make these changes. So if we could have 10 minutes from you, please.
Yeah, just let me get my presentation up.
I won't start until you have.
There we go. Can everybody see that okay?
I can, yes, and I'm sure therefore everyone else can.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, firstly, thanks to Thomas for teeing me up so perfectly there. That was wonderful. Thanks for that. It's almost like we did the practice beforehand, Thomas. So, first of all, I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Science Committee for the opportunity to talk with you today about the sustainability challenges that we're all facing as part of the global population. But I think also to think about the opportunities for driving sustainable innovation strategies as part of supporting the shift towards net zero economies. So for those of you who are meeting for the first time, I work for a company called Kroder International. We're a FTSE 50 manufacturer of specialty technologies, mostly pointed towards the consumer and life sciences sectors. And we supply key ingredients to companies such as Unilever, L'Oreal, Syngenta, and Pfizer. And as such, we're an important innovation partner in helping our customers address these innovation and sustainability challenges. This first slide, which you'll be happy I'm not going to run through in detail, is just a simple extract from our strategy presentation. And it highlights our purpose of smart science to improve lives. And we're doing this by utilising technological expertise to create a positive difference to the environment and society. Of course, we do this using not only our scientific, but also our cultural strengths. But I think the key element that I really want to highlight within this is our commitment to be the most sustainable supplier of innovative ingredients to allow Kroder and our partners to tackle some of the world's biggest challenges, and through this be climate, land and people positive by 2030. Okay, so our approach to this is aligned to 3 different areas. And it's important that we've aligned these actions to the aims of the UN SDGs and kind of define these as a template, because focusing on these, we believe, are material to our business, and it's where we can have the most impact. In our climate pillar, this has meant focusing on reducing emissions, saving more carbon than we use through clever technologies for carbon cover, and also innovating sustainably by increasing the percentage of bio-based raw materials used in our products and processes. Alongside this, our target for becoming land positive focuses on supporting the development of increasingly effective sustainable technologies for farmers, and through this save more land than we use to support the farming of bio-based feedstocks for our sustainable innovation target. These actions are designed to help address the carbon iceberg that most consumer care-focused manufacturing organisations like Kroder are facing, where the direct Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbons emissions are dwarfed by the overall Scope 3 emissions, which are coming from upstream purchased goods and services combined with downstream processing, use and end-of-life treatment. So by 2030, we'll be climate positive by reducing our carbon footprint and increasing the use of bio-based raw materials, whilst the in-use benefits of our ingredients will enable more carbon to be saved than we emit through our operations and supply chain. Specifically, this means that we will reduce emissions by achieving our science-based targets, which is in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Our products will contain over 75% by weight of bio-based raw materials, helping absorb carbon from the atmosphere as they grow. And finally, our carbon cover target will avoid 4 times the carbon emissions associated with our business, a 4-to-1 carbon cover ratio. Alongside this, we will be land positive by continuing developing products that allow more land to be saved than is used to grow our bio-based raw materials. Our innovation will help customers to mitigate the impact of climate change and land degradation, increasing the availability of land suitable for growing crops. So this all sounds very interesting, I'm sure, and perhaps giving you a flavour of how Kroder is responding to the opportunities and requirements for a sustainable future. What we've yet to cover, and I'm going to address in the presentation now, is how are we going to do it? I gave a glimpse of this through the targets we've set ourselves, but I wanted to explore our specific actions in greater depth to further illustrate approaches that can be utilised. The first example is our use of biotechnology for the replacement of petrochemical feedstocks. Thomas alluded to this in his last presentation. This offers a route to the elimination of new primary carbon in the supply chains. Typically, some surfactants used within consumer care are manufactured using a petrochemical derivative called ethylene oxide. These products are highly effective and are probably utilised by many of the consumer goods companies that are out there. But alternatives are required by companies looking to reduce their carbon impact. We have a facility in the US based in Delaware, where we've invested in an approach to create bio-derived ethylene oxide, basically coming from corn. And through this, we became the first to offer 100% bio-based surfactants at scale. Of course, saving carbon across the supply chain is an important element of being carbon positive. There are 2 key approaches to this. The first is to simply eliminate carbon through the supply chain, for example, by utilising renewable energy or the use of bio-based ingredients, as I highlighted in the previous eco surfactant example. But sometimes people don't think about product in use, and this is our second approach. And it's not so much about using less carbon in our products, but it's more about understanding how the carbon impact across the supply chain is measured so that overall we use less carbon and avoid emissions within the supply chain and in use with the product. So this in-use carbon benefit is superbly demonstrated through our laundry application product, which is called Cold Tide Radiance. It's used in fabric conditioners. The whole concept of this product is that it extends the lifetime of clothes by minimizing fiber damage through wear and maintaining garment color during washing. What this leads to is that clothes look good for longer and need replacing less frequently. And as such, for every ton of coal-tied radiance used within a fabric conditioner system, the avoided carbon emissions of 102 cars driven by 1 year and avoided water use of enough drinking water to satisfy more than 200,000 people for 1 year are achieved. And so, moving on to my final slide, the last example I want to highlight is the use of industrial biotechnology to create new surfactants. Biotech combines a bio-based approach to the creation of new materials with one that is also of low energy. This approach can make natural surfactants through fermentation of vegetable oils, yeast and glucose, and output materials such as sophorolipids offer a new and sustainable alternative to petrochemical surfactants, which offer fantastic opportunities for both reducing carbon and providing better sustainability benefits in these consumer-focused industries. I think maybe the final comment I'd like to make alludes to something that Andrea said earlier on, which is around the political strategies required to deliver this. Kroder's a pretty well invested organization. We've been able to move in this area under our own steam, but unfortunately, I think if we're going to get to the next industrial level of utilization of these products, we need a more coordinated impact, and we probably need a nicely coordinated government strategy to deliver this kind of revolution in sustainable raw materials. So I think finally, I'd just like to conclude on that point. Thanks to everybody for listening, and I'd like to hand back to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. That was excellent and very clear. I suppose a couple of brief points, if I may. Two, firstly, when you look at the overall carbon envelope, if you like, of the product, so you're by making a product last longer, it uses less water, etc. Is that a generally accepted way of measuring the total amount of carbon in I don't know, would you call it a value chain if you've got a product?
I'll address that one first. So it's becoming increasingly accepted, but only as the ability to do kind of cradle to grave life cycle assessments has become easier for us to manage. There are now standard systems of measuring in-use carbon across supply chains, and our suppliers, companies like Kroder and BASF and companies like Unilever, have become far more integrated in sharing that carbon data across their supply chain, so we can understand the real use implications, and as such not kind of become embroiled in some sort of greenwashing where carbon benefits are claimed but not really delivered. And I think that what you've got here are three organizations who take this approach seriously and value the reputation that we've built up over years. So I think that's the key thing. It is available to companies to take that approach. I think the other element is that we have to look at every opportunity for us to work together. And so whilst we can do our own impact, by utilizing renewable energy, if you can fundamentally have an overall impact on avoided carbon, where the actual carbon used by Kroder might go up by 2, but the carbon avoided by Unilever goes down by 10. That's got to be of overall benefits to society. And, we have to build that into our carbon calculation.
Excellent. So that's what I wanted to hear, exactly that it's an overall reduction. And the other thing which struck me was that as we move to sort of bio-based chemical creation, what is the issue around the overall amount of land available to be able to grow enough, whether it's palm oil or corn that you mentioned there? Is not land use fighting for feeding this increasing population at the same time as we're trying to use the land to create alternatives to fossil fuels, and we're potentially handing over large amounts of, certainly in the south of England, farmland to solar farms? How do we balance all that?
So that's a very critical point that that you've brought up there. I mean, this decision of fuel over food, I think, is one that's been burning for a while. We've dealt with that personally by inserting a crop innovation target. So I mentioned earlier, as well as consumer-focused industries, we're also active within the life sciences sector, within crop innovation. So we'd supply to Syngenta, Corteva, DuPont, the agrochemical division of BASF, all of the big players. And if in our innovations we can help avoid the depletion of land or improve the efficiency of agricultural output from land, then that has got to be a benefit. So again, it's a little bit like the end-to-end carbon calculation. You have to look at not only your impact on land negatively, but also your positive impact. And if the ratio is in the right way, then of course that's to be favourable. So we have this 4-to-1 carbon cover target where we try to save 4 times as much land as we actually utilise for the generation of agrochemical foodstuffs as input materials into our organisation.
Brilliant. Nick, thank you very much indeed. Right, we will now move on to our final speaker, but before I do that, can I just remind people to use the Q&A function if they've got any questions, because after we've heard from Jem, we will be taking questions from the wider audience. So, as I said, we're going to move on to our final speaker, which is Dr. Jem Woods, who is a reader in sustainable development at the Centre for Environmental Policy, Imperial College. And Jem, you're going to look at how the numbers actually stack up and take us through those. So if I could ask you for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I hope everyone can hear me. And I'd also like to thank the previous speakers for setting the stage so incredibly well. As you've said, I'm a reader in sustainable development, and I'm based in the Centre for Environmental Policy. And my work for the last 30 years has focused on land use and development, and particularly land use and development right around the world. So I've had a focus on issues that have affected that, particularly looking at, for example, bioenergy and the impacts of bioenergy. And a lot of that is relevant to what I'm about to say when we consider the use of biological sources of carbon for consumer products. Let me see if I can get this to move on. There we go. So we've worked in my department and indeed have just set up the Imperial College Centre of Excellence for life cycle applications, and I'm delighted to have heard Nick mention the need for life cycle assessment and life cycle assessment approaches. And these are fundamental concepts for assessing the impacts of the delivery of products to society and indeed the services that we all depend on in society. And those life cycle approaches are founded on systems thinking, systems level thinking. And there are no more complex systems that we as humanity use and depend on than the biological systems that provide us with the food and other services. But there are also extreme limitations to the application of life cycle assessment. And so we've heard from Nick and Thomas and Andrea, we've heard about cradle to grave, farm to fork, these kinds of concepts. But when we apply these concepts into the real world, we now need to be able to extend them into those consequential impacts that you mentioned, Stephen. And so we've started to move towards a process of layering activities and thinking onto this systems level frameworks, these systems level conceptual frameworks for assessing the impacts of existing and new, the delivery of existing and new services to humanity. And so for the UK, for example, and indeed much of the Western, the rich world, we've slowly started to gravitate towards these 3 securities. So energy security, environmental security, which includes climate change, but is not solely defined by climate change and climate change metrics, and human security. How do we fulfill not only our aspirations, but the aspirations of future generations of our children and our children's children? So we have a perspective there that in many ways defines policy and policy making, particularly in the rich world. But of course, That's an upper level metric, and we need a set of metrics that actually directly affect us as individuals. And there we really care about usability and reliability. We care about environmental health, and so the air quality directives that we see in our urban areas, etc., those are really designed to affect things like air quality, to improve our air quality, to improve the impacts and the longevity of life and the quality of life that we have. And of course, underpinning all of that is the cost of delivery of those services, particularly the financial costs of delivery. And so we've heard a reasonable amount about the costs of delivering new products to society, or at least products derived from new forms that aren't so environmentally damaging. But of course, geopolitics gets in the way of all of that and has a habit of changing things quite rapidly. And so where we've seen the emergence of energy security, which actually predated the Ukrainian crisis, food security is now coming back up to the top. And it's this balance between acute and chronic impacts, which defines, if you like, our legislative and our policy-based responses to the delivery of sustainability. And you may well be thinking, why on earth is this academic banging on about these major issues? And the reason is, and we've heard some of that in some of the questions that Stephen's already delivered, the reason is that as we move back towards a greater delivery of modern biological services, of course, fossil fuels and oil and gas are historical biological products. As we move back to modern, real recent biological products, we need to have frameworks that can encompass all of these aspects of sustainability. And so as we think about those issues and we start to configure our service delivery systems, we have to go back to fundamentals. And this is a figure that came from one of the leading scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change who thinks about mitigation activities. That's Pete Smith, who's based at Aberdeen University, but underpins the approaches in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to mitigation of climate. And so here we see that emergent understanding as affecting the global carbon cycle. And that is, of course, directly relevant to the biological origins of the carbon that might go into the chemicals and chemical products that we're talking about. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has rightly been fixated and focused on fossil energy and replacing fossil energy. And the reason for that is that all of the carbon in the fossil fuels comes from geological reservoirs. I said that they're originally biological, but actually they're in geological stored reservoirs of carbon. And when we burn those fossil fuels, we release that carbon straight back to the atmosphere. And so that's why we see such a rapid increase, or industrialization has seen such a rapid increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that is the underpinning core reason that we see climate change and global warming happening. When we switch to biological resources, here to bioenergy, we use that same photosynthetic carbon cycle that drove the original stocking of carbon into those geological resources for fossil energy. We use that and we take that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we grow the plants that were just mentioned in terms of Nick Challoner's talk. We grow the plants that sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then we have the biomass that we burn, and that releases that carbon back into the atmosphere. And so if we're very efficient about that, that cycle is carbon neutral, i.e. no more carbon appears in the atmosphere than we've taken out of the atmosphere by growing those plants. Now, there are some new technologies that are emerging that will allow us to change those cycles. And so we may have heard about carbon capture and storage, particularly for electricity production, where we burn, for example, coal or gas in fossil fuel plants, and we capture that carbon dioxide that's emitted when we burn those fuels, and before it gets into the atmosphere, and we pump that down into geological resources. Now, a really exciting area for climate mitigation is the potential to take, for example, bioenergy systems And rather than releasing the carbon that's been stored in the plants on the land back to the atmosphere, we intercept that and put that down into geological reserves. So old oil and gas wells, you can intercept the carbon dioxide that's in the flue gases and pump it back down into old oil or gas wells, and indeed other places. And so there's a set of technologies that have got us very excited, because these actually represent negative emission technologies. We can actively pump carbon out of the atmosphere. But it's also true, but has not yet been really addressed or really adopted by many of the world scientists who look at climate mitigation activities. It's also true that we can take biological growth, the growth of crops and the growth of forests, and we can do something very similar, but we can link the ability to take carbon from the atmosphere into plants and store it both in land, but also link that with weathering, or link that with carbon capture and storage, by building up the stocks of carbon in the products that we might think of using. And so that's really what we're really starting to think about, and really it's such an exciting approach, as has been mentioned by the previous three speakers. And so it's that new perspective that I really wanted to talk about. Now, when I come back to that bigger picture about the 4 securities framework that I was talking about, here in some work that we helped develop with a large team of international scientists and institutions around the world, called the Global Calculator, which was used to inform bilateral negotiations in the lead up to the Paris Climate Agreement. We pointed out that whilst much of the attention in terms of climate mitigation was focused on fossil fuel use, actually our ability to use land, the humanity's ability to use land efficiently, was being misconceived. And if we weren't careful about it, we weren't careful about how we used land, we would end up causing more emissions, or at least limiting our ability to deal with climate change, than simply through fossil fuels or renewable energy alone. And so the emergence of land use, food production, and food consumption through diets as potential options for us to manage the global carbon cycle, and therefore mitigate climate change, started to emerge as really important things that we needed to do alongside the management of fossil fuels in supply chains. And you can see again here that unless we talk about the use of biological carbon molecules in things other than food, and think very carefully about that, we could end up exacerbating the problems to do with climate and climate mitigation. But so we've been involved with, although we weren't directly involved with the UK's carbon calculator, which is what I'm showing here, we've been involved in a set of tools that allow the end user, often decision makers, policy makers at national levels, national to global levels, to understand what kinds of interventions might be possible and how important those interventions might be between now and 2050 in order to mitigate climate, in order to manage climate change. And all I'll say is that in this illustrative net zero pathway produced by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy using the UK's Mackay carbon calculator, what we see is a real and important need to enhance carbon stocks in the landscape. So it's not just carbon capture and storage technologies, but it's also the tools that will allow us to remove, in this case, to remove substantial amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and store them outside the atmosphere. And again, when we think about the use of biological carbon molecules in delivering these new products and services to society, we need to be able to enhance these non-atmospheric carbon stocks. And so here you see that the importance of carbon stocks on land, but also potentially elsewhere through carbon capture and storage technologies. And so I'm just going to come back now to the carbon cycle, because it's so important.
Jim, if you could just have one final minute, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks. I'm very nearly finishing up. So here in the carbon cycle, we can see that when we use that carbon, we take it out of the atmosphere, we produce, actually we've heard about ethanol, but we produce carbon products, and then we use them at the end of life. We end up re-releasing that carbon to the atmosphere. But of course, And there are all sorts of greenhouse gas emissions and other uses and other impacts associated with that. But when we think about the capture of that carbon and these multiple end-of-life options, the multiple lives of carbon that become possible when we turn those carbon into products, then we can think about configuring this end so that it becomes an important component of managing climate and managing mitigation options. And here, for example, is a very recent example of the capture of biological carbon in a biogas production unit, and the ability to hydrolyze water to produce hydrogen and then reduce the carbon dioxide that's produced to produce green molecules. And that is also tied in with green ammonia, etc., and green production. And so I'm rushing now to get through to the final point, because it's come up time and time again. But when we think about sugar and corn as products of the carbon and the energy that might go into these new products, they are being produced almost at the scale of oil. And so scale is a really important issue globally. And what we need to understand is how we impact on the production of these primary feedstocks that might end up going to provide us with those new biological carbon molecules that then go into the small green molecules that end up in the surfactants and the products that we've been talking about. And I don't have too much time to go into this, but that issue of scale at the production point and where value is added in the supply chains, the biological supply chains, becomes really important. And all I wanted to say with this slide is that at the moment, the changes in the technologies, the innovations in the technologies that allow us to pull those biological complex carbon molecules apart and put them into new products and the new systems that we've been talking about are very important. And it looks like we're now able to think about new technologies that will allow us to maximize the overall scale, but also allow us to enhance the scale economies at much smaller products and processing scales. And with that, I think I'll just sum up what the overall outcomes of what I've been talking about. So clearly, in terms of the Sustainable Development Challenge, we need to build this. We need to be able to feed a growing global population, and so anything that we do must not adversely perturb food security, and must improve, as Nick was talking about, must improve the impacts on agriculture. Simultaneously, though, we have to be able to meet the challenges of energy security. And so whatever we do in this new world of small green molecules and consumer products, we must be able to enhance the provision of energy and enhance the provision of food. And we need to do all that whilst regenerating the environment, restoring the habitats, particularly those fragile habitats in rainforests that we've been hearing about, enhancing biodiversity, securing water supplies, and adapting to climate change. So it really is a complex and difficult challenge. And so those biological sources of carbon that we've been talking about, we need them to manage terrestrial carbon stocks as an essential prerequisite to a sustainable development transition at national to global scales. Thank you.
Jen, thank you very much indeed. A huge amount of really interesting stuff in there. I was no wonder you couldn't get it, get it all in time. I was looking at two things, I suppose. Is firstly the global carbon cycle you showed and the various models. And I think you, model G, I can't remember what it was now, I've written it down. I know H showed using the oceans to potentially put carbon back into, but I suspect there is problems with acidification and that sort of thing of the oceans, if you were to do that.
Well, acidification is occurring at the moment as a result of increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and so it's the transfer of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in form of carboxylic acid that's causing increased acidification in the oceans, and that is one of these really quite frightening potential threshold impacts that may end up stopping the oceans being such a major carbon sink. They're currently, like the world's land, a major carbon sink, and there are real potential issues with increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere.
Thank you. Yes. My other point was that there's quite a lot of good modelling. There's some great technology you highlighted. We've heard some excellent potential solutions to keep us down to a climate increase of 1.5 degrees. But we probably have the technology already now developed. We know what we need to do. Are we going to be able to do it at enough speed and enough scale to actually reach the point at which we have decarbonised enough to restrict it to 1.5 degree increase?
I was going to say there is no short answer to this. The short answer is probably no, and that's something that's really exercising the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's scientists at the moment, who are the Working Group 3 on mitigation, are currently finalising their next report, and the rate of change that's required is extremely sobering, and the scale of that change is extremely sobering. And so some of what we might think of these shorter term targets, particularly the 2030 targets, we really need to be focusing and investing on and investing substantially in how to get there, probably faster than we thought previously, in order to maintain any chance of getting to that 1.5 degree sea level.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very, very important point. So thank you all to my panelists. Fantastic presentations. We're now going to move on to questions, and we've got about 25 minutes. So the first question comes from our newly elected president, Viscount Stansgate, Stephen Benn. Stephen.
Hi, and thanks to all the speakers for a remarkably good range of presentations. Actually, I think of all our recent meetings, we've had more to take in as a result of your 4 excellent presentations at one go than we might normally have. And there are tons of questions, and I've only got time to ask 1 or 2. And I don't mind who answers some of them. Listening to you all makes me think maybe the government should develop a molecule strategy. Is that an absurdly wrong idea? Because no one ever thinks of it in those terms, but obviously many of you do. I'm convinced more than ever of the issue that, in fact, Stephen identified in his earlier question about the tension between the use of land for food and the use of land for non-fossil fuel carbon. And if anyone wants to say a little bit more about that, I'd be grateful, because it clearly is a very, very big issue. And the third thing I wanted to ask, if it isn't too antiquated, we want to reduce carbon emissions and therefore we want to phase out coal. But am I right that coal could still be used as a feedstock for chemicals without burning it? Might that help as part of this equation in a way to think of coal in a new way? And I'll leave it there, and if anyone wants to come in, I'd be very grateful.
Stephen, thank you. Anyone want to pick out any of those? Just unmute yourselves and chime in. Thomas was first and then Nick.
Yes, thank you. Let me start maybe with the last one. Yes, you can have chemical processes based on coal. This was done in the past, but most of the time it was done when there was war, because it's not the most efficient way. As I had explained, all these value chains are focusing on being efficient and have the highest possible productivity. So yes, in principle, coal is a source of carbon, but it's not the most efficient way of doing it.
Okay.
Maybe with regards to the other two, yes, the tension between the land use, that is of highest concern for all of us. Nick has spoken about that. BASF has the same perspective. We need to increase dramatically the productivity per square kilometer of land. Otherwise, we have an issue, right? So we know that. And that's also the challenge. Where are we getting the carbon from? And that brings me to your first question, the molecule strategy. When we are talking about the products that we are having and the kind of material world that we are seeing, the most important thing is where are we getting the carbon molecules from. So it's maybe not necessary to have a molecule strategy in the sense that like of a recipe, right? Cooking recipe, but a clear strategy. What do we want to achieve? In which direction do we want to go? I think that would be important.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything?
Thomas did a brilliant job of answering all the questions there, Thomas. So well done. But maybe just a bit of an add that might help on the land use target is that I'm not a biotechnologist. I'm a chemist by training. Spent most of my career either in business or developing new chemical molecules. But I think we all recognise that biotech could be a fundamental way forward, if we can get it right at the industrial scale. Now, at this point in time, we've industrialized it for pharmaceutical applications, and I think we've got a strong industrialization for food and associated ingredients. But the true use of biotech in the industrial scale in the chemical space, I think, is yet to be developed. And I think this kind of takes us back to this point that Andrea made at the beginning. If we want to work as academics, government, industry in a partnership way, then finding ways in which we can develop the biotech economy in the UK, I think could be a really interesting way of not only meeting our sustainability targets, but importantly, giving the UK a really strong technological edge against some of its competitors as we start to move into a post-COVID world.
And finally, on palm oil, is there something that governments, either individually or internationally, should do to prevent the huge growth of palm oil, which, am I right, is now unstoppable?
Jim, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes.
Anyway, just before I do, pass over to you, Stephen. I've just been told Minister on his feet, vote imminent.
Right.
So
okay.
if when the bell goes, I'm going to hand over to you to continue to chair,
Okay.
if that's okay. Jim, if you could, address Stephen's points.
Well, I think I think there's a bit of a linkage between your first question around coal and palm oil. So I think first of all, it's absolutely right that there is a really substantive potential from real investment, thoughtful and smart investment in biotechnology. And that's right from the primary production of the biomass, from the growing of the crops, right through to the end use, and indeed through to this multiple lives that I was talking about. At the moment, we're too constrained by thinking of a single end of life for these molecules that we've managed to put into the products. And so if I come back to the coal question, it is entirely possible to take coal, to go through the kinds of carbon capture and storage, or to do other things with coal and end up with a whole range of products that doesn't necessarily result in the release of that carbon into the atmosphere. My fear is what that would mean is it's the easy option out, and we will not invest where the real opportunity lies, which is in these smart systems where we need to really think about how do we address innovation in the biotechnology systems that we want to deploy. And so if I come back to palm oil, the growth of oil palm, if we step back and we think about it as a crop, it's a tree-based crop that doesn't require very much intervention in the soils. So it's actually quite protective of the soils. It's a perennial tree crop. It's very productive for the production of the fatty acids that I think Thomas mentioned earlier on, and Andrea. So it's an incredibly productive crop. So it's not really the crop itself, it's the way that the land is used and the way that crop is implemented that really should be our source of worry and the way we think about it. And there are ways to think in much more integrative and applied ways to the production of crops wherever they are in the world. And so when we think about that, we can address these multiple challenges.
Well, now, thank you very much for that. Stephen is about to tell us that the vote has started.
It has. So I'm going to leave you in Stephen's very capable hands to continue chairing. I'm sure Lee will tell you that our next questioner is Helen Sneddon, but if I don't make it back, can I just personally thank Andrea, Thomas, Nick and Jem for their contributions this evening. I think it's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you very much to the PNSC team of Karen and John and Lee and Ben and Alfie, who is going to be writing this up. So a huge thank you to all of you. But I will pass over to Stephen for the final 15 minutes or so. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're sorry to lose Stephen, but that is life. There is no vote expected on this side, so I won't have to leave. Now, Lee, you just mentioned who the next caller is. Helen.
Stephen, it's Helen Sneddon.
Okay. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. You say that Sunlight isn't a UK brand of dish soap. Did Unilever deliberately target using a fermented sugar ingredient in a market with more eco-conscious consumers than the UK? If so, can you say something about the societal drivers for more eco-conscious markets? Or was it simply serendipity? It was one of the easier drop-in swaps to make.
Thank you very much, Helen, for the question. The answer is that it's both. So firstly, yes, when we are doing our innovations where it makes sense, and it happened that the markets where we launched this mix were markets where it made sense for us to do so. That being said, I just want to specify that our goal is not to sell only to eco-active consumers. So we're not wanting to produce brands that only those people that are super interested in sustainability want. We want to democratize sustainability. So it's designing these products that are superior and affordable. And yes, they also happen to be sustainable. These products need to be the ones that consumers are going to be choosing, not because they are the ones that are willing to compromise, but because they are just the logical choice. And so this mix that I've shown you guys from Sunlight is not one that is designed for eco-actives. It's one that's going to our regular consumers.
Thank you. Helen, I think you had a follow-up, is that right?
No. Well, I think only my sort of follow-up would be do you have a feel for what makes certain markets have a higher percentage of eco-conscious consumers? Is there a political aspect to that, or is it what's changing the culture in those places?
Definitely. Firstly, the thing that I want to clarify is that each market has its own set of aspects of sustainability that matter more to them. So, for instance, in the UK, people care a lot about plastic and about animal cruelty. And on the plastic side, that's a lot a result of all the documentaries that we've seen and those jarring images of turtles with plastic around their necks and so on. In other markets, there are other issues that are closer to their world and that are then causing them more to care more about those specific issues. So water scarcity, for instance, in the markets that are having issues with that. An interesting thing is that I'll give you the example of the Nordics, where the plastic waste system is very much streamlined. So the population believes very clearly that there is no issue with plastic waste. It doesn't end up in the environment because it's very well managed by the municipality. And in these markets, we're seeing that actually plastic waste is not featuring very highly on the radar of consumers when it comes to sustainability concerns. They don't, which is very different to how it is in the UK. So yes, the government can definitely influence the areas of sustainability that people care about.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you, Andrea. We've got lots of other questions, but I could see us exploring the issues around that for quite a long time. Can we move on to Trevor Creighton? Trevor, welcome and put your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Good evening. My question is, prior to Brexit, the UK belonged to an EU-based system called Eco-Label. But since leaving the EU, we're no longer involved in it. Is there any plan to create a UK-based Eco-Label type system? And secondly, one of the Eco-Label criteria is performance against the market leader of a product. So Eco-Label accredited products should be as good as other commercial products. And that was more targeted at Andrea and her comments about green products being perhaps not as good as others and a lot more expensive.
Okay, thanks for that. Andrea, do you want to have another go at this one, please?
Sure. So the first part of the question, I believe, is out of my remit of whether the UK is planning to have an eco-label or not. The second one with whether the products are equal performance or not, I guess it depends on which part of performance you're measuring. So definitely, if we think of what consumers are looking for, and you think of convenience, that's one of the key things that they are interested in. So you might have a product that maybe is equally performing in terms of cleaning, but is a lot more fiddly to use. You need to be taking more steps to use that, and in overall, it is therefore inferior. So there are those people that are very willing to compromise even on convenience, like going and refilling, going with their empty bottles, refilling them because they want to avoid plastic packaging. What we're saying is we want to avoid consumers having to make this compromise.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Trevor. Can we move on to Professor Krina Oltean-Dumbrava? I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, and my apologies if not, but please put your question.
It's not really a question, it's more a point of intervening in the calculation of whole life cycle and the life cycle analysis of the global carbon. I think we have to move from cradle to grave to cradle to cradle and reintegrate it in order to create a really circular economy, whatever the economy we are speaking about. So we have to work on the culture of using this methodology of calculation and push it in the future rather in what is happening right now.
Okay, well, now who would like to take that observation on board with a comment of your own? Anyone? Thomas.
Yes, absolutely. So 100% agree that more needs to be done when it comes to the circularity. I give you an example. We are heavily investing into chemcycling, so chemical recycling, where we are breaking down existing waste into molecular level in order to be then able to really reuse it for whatever we want to do. This is a full cycle then. But I can tell you, it will not be easy. It's very controversial. People don't like it. They don't understand it. They don't understand the technology. But this is exactly one of the examples that you're talking about, the life cycle that you need to, the circularity that you need to close. And you really need to go from cradle to cradle, and you need to be open when it comes to the technology that you're using. And it will not help us if we are just trying to cut out certain technologies before we even use them.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Can we move on now to Peter Clark? Peter, are you there? Lovely. Please put your question.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to thank you very much for the presentations, by the way. What do you see as the single most important action? Or maybe I'll be kind, I'll give you two potential actions. What are the two most important actions that are needed from government and or industry in order to build these new carbon value chains of the future in the UK? So it might be investment in innovation, pre-commercial demonstration. Are we lacking data on the volumes and types of feedstock, or policy? So feel free to choose from those or come up with your own answer, but be really keen on your viewpoints. Thank you.
Excellent question. We'll just go in order. Jem Woods, would you like to start? And then we'll just go through the rest.
Yes, well, Peter, thanks for that. Thanks for the simple question. I think that the main thing is to strike a balance. But one of the really, for me, the absolutely central thing is to have a consistency in policy message through time. So to set the long-term signals and the long-term targets so that industry knows what it's trying to optimize towards and trying to configure itself towards. And then secondarily is this balance between public and private good and the investments required with public good investments and private good investments. And it seems clear to me, given the discussions that we've just had, that there is a real need to balance the public good investment in what we call the technology readiness levels, so in early technology readiness levels, and to invest in the innovation cycles. So for me, those are the two main things that are needed now.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yes, sure. So I keep it short. Don't ask that question, because what we have tried to convince here we try to come up with a picture where we show the complexity of what we are planning to do. If we are focused only on one piece of it, it will not work. We know that. So we need to free ourselves from the idea we push a button and something magic will happen. No, what we are talking about is a full review of the value chains of the material world that we are having. And I like the ideas of Jem. I think very good starting point to do exactly that. But we really need to free ourselves from thinking we push a button and magic happens. That's not going to work. It's far more complex, and I'm sorry for that, but it's just the truth.
No, that's very good. Andrea.
I agree with both Jem and Thomas that it's very important, firstly, to set a clear target for 2030, because that will send out the right message to the industry, to all the concerned stakeholders, and then work together with the industry on the policies that will help reach that target, which are, yes, exactly, not one singular magical bullet.
Thanks very much. Nick.
Yeah, the danger of going last is that all the good answers have already been taken, haven't
No, you can repeat them.
But I have got one to offer, and you know, from my perspective, it's a little bit different, Thomas, because you know, Tom's generally manufactures things at a scale much bigger than Kroder does. We're in a more speciality arena, so we do benefit sometimes by a lower barrier to entry or a simpler barrier to entry into the supply chain. But what I would say is I think there's some really good early innovation being done in universities and startups within the UK. It's our failure to industrialize sometimes that holds us back. And so what we need to do is find more governmental support, guidance to help steer both established industry and SMEs to create a cohesive ecosystem of solutions that will help us along this decarbonisation strategy.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Well, Peter, that was good value for your question. I want to get in two more before we finish. One is from Tom Harris.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for all the talks today. So my question is, the ongoing supply innovation and the scale up that you've all covered has been logically explained as the ultimate solution to availability of sustainable feedstocks. But delivering those fully integrated replacements is, probably a medium to long-term objective, takes time. So in the meantime, what practical regulatory solutions might you suggest to somehow subsidize the cost of non-virgin fossil products to remove barriers for those dismissive or indecisive consumers that Andrea mentioned? So kind of covering her democratizing sustainability point. So how can the current quality and affordability be maintained and balanced to allow everyone to make more sustainable consumer choices.
Thank you. Now, who would like to answer that first? You don't all have to answer it, but who would like to at least take that point about the regulatory measures? If nobody comes forward, I shall pick one of you.
Well, I mean, I was hoping that Andrew was going to leap forward, but I'll offer a few comments if you like. I mean, I'm not in favour of subsidies in this regard. I think that consumers need to come to their own conclusions, and what Andrew has shown you is that over time we are getting consumers being more sustainably aware, and you know, their purchasing behaviour is appropriate. I think the other element is that it could potentially lead to lazy innovation. You know, it's the second or third time I've had the discussion today. What we need to do is get that perfect triangle of performance, sustainability, and cost that Andrea described exactly right. I think there might be a role, maybe, you know, for the, I mean, you know, you could make justification or small modifications to VAT, perhaps, that might make things a little cheaper in the shop. But you know, we've got to be careful about making the ultimate goal a little bit easier, and therefore not making industry and government and the consumer responsible for its own activity to live sustainably.
Thank you very much. Well, now we'll move on to our last question. We've just got enough time for it, and it's Professor Ian Graham. Ian, I hope you're there. Please put your question.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for all the wonderful talks. My question is really about moving away from land-based biomass production to using existing crop residues and bio-waste from municipal solid waste and various other sources. And is that something which the chemical industry is really serious about? Because most of the talks tonight were about, you know, dedicated crops for producing these feedstocks. And obviously we have to feed 8 to 10 billion people by 2050 as well.
Okay, who would like to go first? Jem.
I'm quite happy to jump in here. There's actually, as Thomas said very nicely, we need to be very careful about not trying to reduce the complexity of this problem. And so one approach, it does make a lot of sense to make more sustainable use of wastes and residues. The only reason you hear some hesitation in my voice is we have to be very careful about perverse outcomes where you start to value what we currently call waste, and they then are no longer waste. They're simply part of the circular economy that we've been talking about. And so that, for me, brings us back to the major justification of thinking about the use, and definitely we are thinking about the use of residues, particularly crop residues, as part of the feedstocks for delivering the green carbon molecules that we've been talking about. But once we start to think about that, and we start to think about, for example, crop yields, predominantly food crop yields, actually what we might target is enhancing the efficiency of photosynthesis. So you produce more biomass overall. So you may end up producing more food crop and more of what we currently call residues, driven by these new markets. And I think the careful application of that kind of thinking is exactly where we need to be moving towards.
All right, thank you very much indeed. We've just got a few seconds left. Do either of the other speakers want to add 20 seconds before we have to finish? Thomas.
I can only second what Jem just said. I have spent the last 6.5 years working in natural value chains, and I have experienced exactly what Jem is talking about. All of a sudden, everybody is moving to another waste stream, and all of a sudden the waste stream is worth more than what you had on the value stream before. And as I said, we need to think big here. 10% of all oil and gas in usage at the moment needs to be replaced. And as an economist, I can only say supply and demand will do their job when it comes to that. And this is exactly what Jem is talking about.
Thank you. Next, 20 seconds.
Nothing further to add.
That's fine. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, well, in which case, look, we've reached 7 o'clock. I can't tell you how grateful we all are in the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee that you've given us the time to come along today. It's been exceptionally interesting. Stephen is very sorry he had to go and vote, and I'm very glad that I didn't have to, because I would have missed any part of this. And we really are grateful. It's been an enormous amount to take in, but we're going to have a report on this written up for Science in Parliament. And it just remains really, before people finally leave, to say thank you again to all of you, the speakers, to thank my colleague Lee Jeffs and the team that works for the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee, which includes Karen and John and Ben and our colleague who writes it up and so on. And can I just remind everybody that our next meeting is going to be on the anniversary of D-Day, Monday the 6th of June, when the theme will be coastal water quality. And if anyone would like to come back and join us then, including, by the way, our 4 speakers, you'd be very, very welcome. Otherwise, thank you and good night to everybody. And it's over and out.